This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. One of the world's leading international economists destroys Republican claims that America's debt will cause us to become like Greece or Italy or some other economic basket case. He says it's like saying RG3's injured knee means he'll wind up in a nursing home. There's no chance Barack Obama will be forgotten to history. But what factors do make a president forgettable? Government professor Michael Gerhardt gives us a rundown on the most forgotten of our chief executives. And Bill Press talks with Congresswoman Jackie Speier about sexual abuses in the U.S. military. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Posen is president of the world's leading independent economic think tank, and he says Republicans are fundamentally crazy when they predict that the national debt will send the United States the way of Greece. Such a comparison, quote, is beyond apples and oranges, close quote. And he explains why. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the world's leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. He is one of the world's foremost experts on fiscal and monetary policy, financial crises, and the economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States. Adam Posen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Oh, I'm glad to be back.
And nice to have you. As a world-renowned expert on international finance, where do you come down in the age-old debate between austerity and stimulus as the best way to revive a flagging economy?
As long as you're not a tiny economy with real risk capital flight, you want to err on the side of stimulus. Getting into a recession can be self-defeating, even for consolidating your budget problems, let alone for eating away at your economic seed corn. So you have to be aggressive and try to stimulate your way out, both monetary and when things are really bad with fiscal means as well. The only caveat is when things get better, you got to be prepared to reverse it. At the moment, the U.S. may be making that transition, but I don't see any other countries ready to make that transition yet.
What's an example of a small economy?
Well, I mean, the one very much in the news is Greece, but Ireland or Portugal would be similar. Or in the past, you could talk about Argentina. Small is partly a question of sheer population GDP, but it's also a question of how it's perceived in world markets. Are they dependent on outside resources, and are they at risk of losing access to those outside credits? Which, again, for all the talk about U.S. debt, U.S. is not in any such danger.
Okay. Now, can you explain for the non-economist listening why it is that as the population grows, and even if an economy grows a little bit, productivity is down?
Well, there are a number of ways that can happen. The way to think about productivity is how much you do with the resources you got. So, it's how well and how smart and how hard the person any average worker works, and also how effective are the tools, the processes, technology, but technology in the broadest sense that they have available. And so over the long term, the only way you get ahead is through productivity growth. Otherwise, you just add stuff or you just add people per person, you don't get more value. In a recession, productivity tends to behave in odd ways. So you can have a productivity surge at one point when you're firing lots of people, but orders remain the same and workers are very scared and work lots of overtime. And that's essentially what happened in the U.S. in 2009, 2010. That temporarily makes your numbers look good, but it's not a sustainable source of productivity growth. It's not like training workers or investing in new technologies. Similarly, on the way out of a recession, you can be keeping your remaining workforce on staff because they're your skilled workers, your core workers, and maybe be having fewer orders. And particularly in the service sectors, you can imagine a real estate agent. In the boom years, they were doing 20 deals a week and only having to work 40 hours. In the bust years, they have to work 60 hours a week to scare up 10 deals. their productivity has swung hugely, but it's mostly a reflection of the cycle. It's not a reflection of anything underlying. So when you're a policymaker sorting through this is hard, but I mean the big thing is when you're in extremes of the cycle, big downturns, big upturns, you don't want to put too much faith in a given year's productivity number.
In Europe, where a number of countries have undergone financial shock and austerity has been imposed, the people seem to reject the solutions. Italy just elected a government opposed to the austerity measures that the European Union is insisting upon. So what is a political or a banking solution when there's popular resistance?
It's a good question. There sometimes there's popular resistance, and it's willfully ignoring the realities. And again, you can point to a country like Argentina in the past or Greece in the last couple of years that there just is a hard stop because people have stopped lending to them, and if you don't cut back in the government, then something else is going to go, and something else probably worse. If for other countries like Italy, it's a fair thing for the public to say we don't like this particular course. Now, that leads you back essentially to the negotiating table with the people who've been lending money to Italy, which is effectively the banks of the Northern Europe, as well as the rich older people in Italy. And you're essentially going back and saying it's like a mortgage restructuring. You're saying, all right, if you insist on my paying the whole thing, there's a chance I'm going to walk away and you're going to be left holding the bag. Why don't you restructure the payments and let me pay less overall and over more time? And that's the kind of negotiation you got to have. I mean, there are a lot of fancy policy ways you can hide that, but that's effectively what this is about.
We're speaking with Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. In America, the Republicans are the party of austerity, and they just lost a national election and are very unpopular in the polls. So do they know something the average American worker doesn't?
No. I mean, first off is they're the party of nominal austerity. I mean, there are a few people in it, as well as some blue dog Democrats, who really are about austerity, and I may disagree with that in timing, but at least it's a principled position. There are plenty of other Republicans, as you well know, and your audience well knows, who are just about making sure there's no tax increases and spending a lot on the military, which is not an austerity program. In fact, it's the opposite of that, and so we shouldn't let them claim that title any more than being so-called pro-life or whatever. In terms of them knowing something the rest of America doesn't know, it's not there. There is a reality about our healthcare system being fundamentally messed up, and we have to work on getting that paid for. But that's a public and a private issue. It's the whole system. It's not an entitlements issue. There are ways that we need to change our tax system, but they're probably not the ways that the so-called austerity advocates want. I mean, some of the independent austerity advocates, people like P. Peterson, who supports the Peterson Institute, but is by no means what we're independent of. I mean, he's actually been pretty reasonable on that. Robert Rubin's been pretty reasonable on that. A bunch of people out there who are pro-austerity, a little more than I would be, but who at least want to pay for it in terms of taxes and not just cutting everything down.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, the Republicans are always saying we have to have the massive spending cuts without increased taxes, or we'll wind up like a Greece or Italy or some other European country of choice. What is wrong with that logic?
It's just fundamentally crazy. It's like saying, a world-class athlete goes out, RG3, the new quarterback for the Redskins, goes out and injures his knee, and somebody says, oh my God, you injured your knee, you're going to end up like the little old lady at the nursing care down the street. These are fundamentally different people, and similarly, it's fundamentally different economies at fundamentally different stages. The U.S. doesn't have that kind of debt problem. The U.S. has payment abilities that these other countries don't have. The U.S. has a size and a stability these other countries don't have, and it's just beyond apples and oranges. It's just not a valid comparison. In fact, the comparison isn't even valid for the UK or for Japan or for Germany. I mean, there's a lot of countries who are very vulnerable to international debt, but the major democracies are not those.
Now, in countries that have tried it, austerity seems mostly to burden the working man or woman by depressing wages, which depresses consumer demand. Do you believe that raising the minimum wage in the United States is a good idea, and if so, by how much?
I got to admit, on this, I'm a little less along the what I consider a wishful line. I know, and I'm friends with Alan Kruger, who's the CEA chair at the moment and Senate Council of Economic Advisors chair, and he did a lot of the important work on how under certain circumstances, if you raise the minimum wage, it's actually a positive thing for the economy and can create jobs. I think that's probably true, and I can think of some other countries, Germany's one where they have no minimum wage, where the conditions are even more ripe for that. In the U.S. right now, we can do that, and I wouldn't mind it, but we then have to be prepared that a certain number of jobs are going to move into the informal sector, meaning a lot of illegal or underpaid migrant workers. And that's fine, but you got to accept that that may be part of the deal if you raise the minimum wage.
But isn't it better economically for the country in general? I mean, you've got more money in people's pockets so they can go out and spend more, and the cycle continues that way?
Yes, it is. I would rather, though, see us do it through restructuring the tax code. So the tax code was more progressive, and you had a larger earned income tax credit and helped the working poor through that means, and tax higher people at the rich end or people who have unearned income. Because to me, the advantage of doing it through the tax code is then it's not on the burden of the individual business. The market sets the wage, but you can try to beef up people's actual take-home pay. And so I'd rather do it that way.
Okay. Now, what is your forecast as to both the short-term and long-term financial picture for the U.S.? What's the proper balance between spending cuts and higher revenues, and should any cuts from entitlements like Medicare, Social Security, or Medicaid, should we go that route at all?
I think there's room to do some limited tweaks to Social Security, particularly on the end of raising the cap on income that gets taxed for Social Security. I think that would make a huge difference and would be perfectly fair. I also think it's reasonable to maybe stretch back a bit the age at which people get Social Security, but again, not in a huge way. And just a few tweaks like that make Social Security perfectly sustainable. Medicare is a different issue. As I said, we have an overall health care problem in this economy. It has to do with our weird mix of public and private. A particular issue is the administrative costs and the costs imposed by having private insurers out there playing a less than constructive role in a lot of ways in terms of price setting and passing on costs and taking fees. I think that's got to be tackled rather than Medicare per se. In general, if you talk about the financial state of the U.S., I mean the public debt as well as the household debt, I think we're on a good path. I do think if the economy recovers reasonably strongly in 2013 and 2014, as I do expect it will, thank goodness, it's reasonable for us to ease up on the fiscal stimulus and thereby have more money for a rainy day. Not because of some morality play for austerity, not because we're going to hit a debt wall, but just sensibly when times are better, you spend less from the public purse, so you have it to spend more when times are worse.
I really appreciate your outlook on things. I just feel a lot better at the end of the day.
Well, I hope I'm right. There are plenty of things where I forecast that I hope I'm wrong. But on this stuff, I think there's a large range of people reasonable people who would agree. They sometimes say things a little differently because they're trying to achieve a particular budget settlement or a particular political gain, and I understand that. But I think when you just look reasonably objectively at the numbers, the U.S. is okay. There are problems. There's problems in education. There's problems in our labor markets for young people. There's stuff to worry about in healthcare, but on the fundamentals, our finances, hitting a wall, our ability to keep going, we're okay.
Okay. Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the world's leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. Adam, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to speaking with you again soon.
I appreciate that, and I look forward to it.
Thank you very much. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. How does a chief executive join the ranks of most forgotten presidents? Professor Michael Gerhardt tells us that nothing memorable has to happen on your watch, and you serve only one term. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Little Eric Cantor, the prancing political prissy who serves as the GOP's House Majority Leader, apparently thinks he's too slick to get caught in an outright legislative lie. Or maybe he thinks we rubes are too dumb to figure out that he's trying to slick us. Either way, a crude deceit is at the very heart of his Working Families Flexibility Act, which he recently slid through the House. It eliminates a central piece of America's middle-class framework, namely the 8-hour workday and 40-hour week. Under the 1938 Fair Labor Law, bosses can make hourly employees work extra, but only by paying an overtime wage for the added hours. Cantor claims his bill would improve this New Deal protection by letting corporate managers require extra hours on the job without overtime pay by offering comp time to the employees. In other words, work more hours now in exchange for taking off those same number of hours later on. With a wink at corporate lobbyists, Eric slyly refers to this switch as women-friendly, allowing working moms the flexibility to decide when to take time off. Therein lies the lie. It's not workers who get to decide, but bosses. Note that Cantor's bill does not guarantee employees the right to use the time off they would earn by giving up extra pay. They can use the comp time only if and when the employer says it's okay, which might be never. Also, even if employees are granted time off, bosses can require them to be on call during their free time. This is Jim Hightower saying Cantor's bill is a con. It hands workplace flexibility to corporations, not to moms, while also stealing the hard-won right of workers to be assured of an 8-hour day or extra pay. For more information, contact National Partnership for Women and Families at nationalpartnership.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. While President Obama may be facing some issues he'd like to forget, there's no chance he'll be forgotten by history. Author Michael Gerhardt has studied and listed the most forgotten of American presidents and explains how they got that way. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Michael Gerhardt is a professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government. He is one of the nation's leading experts on constitutional law and the author of a fascinating new book called The Forgotten Presidents, Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. Michael Gerhardt, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you. You've written quite an interesting book about the lesser presidents. How do you get to be a forgotten president?
Well, I appreciate the compliment. Thank you. It was fun to write. I think you get to be a less known or even a forgotten president because of a number of different factors. It might be that you served in office a very, very long time ago. It might be you served only a short term in office, perhaps because one died early on in office. It might be because you're sandwiched between two other very dramatic events or more colorful presidencies. It may be that there wasn't some huge war that went on. So a number of different factors might contribute to the fact that some presidents simply are just not remembered anymore.
Have you actually ranked the forgotten presidents, say from most to least forgotten?
I did, yes. And so there's an appendix in the back of the book where I do that. It's a ranking based on a number of different factors, but based on that ranking, I had concluded that Millard Fillmore is the most forgotten president, and Abraham Lincoln is the most remembered.
Now, why Millard Fillmore?
Fillmore, partly because he served a long time ago, served in the first half of the 19th century. He was a vice president who became president upon the death of the incumbent, Zachary Taylor. So Fillmore really completed a term and didn't have a full term on his own, ended up serving for roughly about 2 years. And so that short period of time doesn't help his legacy. He was a terrible speaker. That didn't help either. A lot of more colorful people in and around him, particularly in Congress. All of that sort of helps, in a sense, make his legacy more obscure. And then lastly, he really made a huge mark, to the extent he made one as president, in defending the Fugitive Slave Act. That turned out to be a very important thing, but it also put him on the wrong side of history, which I don't think has helped his legacy.
Okay. Now, you mentioned reasons that, where you can be forgotten or not forgotten. Do you need a war to become a not forgotten president?
Well, you need something. It may not be a war, but wars are not insignificant. I'm going to paraphrase something I think Bill Clinton said when he was president. Without a war, he kind of said offhandedly, it's hard to be considered great. I think that's a roughly accurate paraphrase. But I think to be remembered, you need something memorable to happen. And so a world war, obviously puts Woodrow Wilson on the map, as it did Franklin Roosevelt later. Civil War obviously became a crucible for Abraham Lincoln and many others. So those events clearly mark people, but it's one of a few dramatic events which might bring greater light to a presidency than some other things might.
We're speaking with Michael Gerhardt. He was a professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government, and author of the book The Forgotten Presidents: Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. So a bunch of the forgotten ones were between Andrew Jackson, when this new nation was still getting on its feet, and the Civil War, about a 25-year period or so. Is there a connection there?
I think there is. And it's a very good point. So those presidents are often dismissed between Jackson and Lincoln. There's actually no two-term president between Jackson and Lincoln, and they're all often dismissed as sort of weak, ineffectual non-entities. And I think that actually ends up being a discredit to some extent to the actual impact that they might have had in the Constitution. In fact, I don't think they were weak. They actually they were strong in different ways, sometimes too strong, and sometimes their attempts to be strong provoked stronger reactions from Congress. But I think that the fact that they didn't have two terms and they appeared to be political failures helped to make them more obscure.
So are they forgotten because they didn't see what was coming, or maybe they did but chose not to do anything? Were they just sort of, hey, I'm here for a few years and then I'm out, and there you go?
No, they didn't sit on their hands, which I think is what you'd sometimes think if you read a lot of histories of the period, which is, oh, these people just were non-entities. No, in fact, they actually turned out to be pretty proactive and sometimes quite aggressive. Take Franklin Pierce, for example, sometimes dismissed as weak and ineffective. I actually think Pierce turned out to be stronger and more effective than people might have thought, and it was the very fact that he was so strongly pro-slavery and trying to implement slavery in the state of Kansas, and bring all the federal government's power behind slavery to ensure a pro-slavery constitution there, that Pierce really provoked a real strong backlash. And it put him obviously on the wrong side of history there, but it also means he wasn't so much weak, but he might have been wrong-headed. And the fact that he might have led some people later to want to bury what he did.
I was going to say, maybe best forgotten on something like that. And
right.
Now, does that also influence how things are taught in schools?
It might.
A guy like that who's promoting slavery, do you really want your kids to know all about that?
Well, it is part of American history, and so you don't get to the Civil War without going through Pierce. And because of what Pierce did, it produced something called Bleeding Kansas, which was a mini Civil War in the state of Kansas over slavery. So the Civil War, in some sense, at least Lincoln thought this was partly the fault of Pierce. Pierce thinks Lincoln is more at fault, but obviously historians agree more with Lincoln than they did with Pierce. But Pierce ends up being a sort of an embattled figure, and I think it's partly because he brought such strong federal power on the wrong side of the issue that a lot of historians perhaps dismiss him and therefore put more attention elsewhere.
Yeah, and I agree that everything should be taught equally, but I do wonder if some maybe shy away from some issues in history and because they're trying to protect people, which would be the wrong way to go.
It could be.
Yeah. Can you be a forgotten president and still be great? For instance, James Polk.
I think the answer is yes. I think so. In the book, I'm not trying to rate presidents. I'm not trying to say they're good or bad or evaluate them in any way. I'm just simply trying to describe the impact they had on the Constitution. And Polk is a very good example of a president who served in the roughly first part of the 19th century and is thought by almost every historian to have been quite successful, but is also rarely remembered. He's quite obscure, but he actually achieved every one of his campaign promises, which is rare for a president. And his administration is thought by many people to be the most successful one-term presidency in American history.
Isn't that interesting? Before we let you go, in the age of television and internet, can anyone be forgotten in the future?
I think it's going to be harder. So I think that we end up with a dilemma. I think it's going to be harder to forget particular people because there's going to be more of a record of what they did, but there's also going to be a lot more information about what they did. So it may be harder to figure out what they did. It may be easier to lose a sense of what they actually accomplished. It'll get lost in sort of just a bunch of information, maybe too much information that people have to sift through. So I think it's a two-edged sword. I think they'll be easier to remember, but there'll be people have to work harder to figure out what they did.
I wonder if it creates greater debates, and maybe even though you weren't trying to do it in your book, perhaps people start ranking people because of all the information they have access to.
I think that's right. So, and we tend to have more information about presidents that we admire, and we tend to perhaps not take as much care over the information about presidents we don't admire, and that history tends to recede in our memories.
Okay. Michael Gerhardt is a professor of constitutional law and director of the University of North Carolina Center on Law and Government, and the book is called The Forgotten Presidents, Their Untold Constitutional Legacy. Good stuff. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
And we appreciate your time with us. And this is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who demands that military rape cases be removed from the chain of command.
It is the Full Court Press, coming to you live from our nation's capital, brought to you today by the American Federation of Teachers. The good men and women of the AFT under President Randy Weingarten making a difference in America's classrooms every day. You bet. You can find out more about their good work at aft.org. Well, we've been so consumed with talk about Benghazi and about the IRS and about the Department of Justice and Associated Press. We forget sometimes there are other things going on. There are other important issues in the news. And one thing that almost got lost this week is a second officer of the military who had the job of cracking down on sexual assaults and sexual abuse has been himself now found guilty, or at least charged with sexual abuse. What the hell is going on? Can we trust the military to police itself and correct this problem? Congresswoman Jackie Speier from California has been out in front on this issue more than anybody, or as much as anybody else, I guess we should fairly say, for 2 years. Talk to us often about it. And she joins us again in studio, Congresswoman. Always good to see you.
Great to see you.
So we had this you and I talked about this the last time you were on. This Air Force guy found in a parking lot assaulting a woman in Arlington, Virginia. What's this latest?
So the latest appears to be a case where a SAPRO officer, this is a sexual assault prevention and response officer, they call them SHARP officers, was soliciting women to become part of his prostitution ring. Had actually gotten one to join his ring and was approaching another woman who refused, and then he sexually assaulted her. And what's most egregious about all of this, these are the best of the best. The tip of the spear, as they refer to them. This is someone who was going to be moving quickly up the chain of command. He's a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, but was pointed out to be someone who had great talent, right? Had 80 hours of training, had a background check. And
good Lord, yeah.
It's almost like the sexual predators are seeking to get these jobs so they can prey on the vulnerable. But it just underscores why the military is ill-equipped to police itself, as you termed it, in these kinds of situations, and why so many of us believe that we've got to take these cases out of what's called the chain of command.
Why do you think, what is it about the military as a profession that generates this kind of behavior?
I don't know if there's anything particularly different about the military, but because it's a closed system, much like the Catholic Church was a closed system, and you can kind of police yourselves, you have your own rules, there's an opportunity to sweep a lot of bad conduct under the rug. And that's what's happened in the military for a very long time. And because the chain of command creates this embedded conflict of interest, because sometimes the assailant that you're supposed to report this crime to is the actual abuser or the friend of the abuser, or is looking for a promotion and sees that if he actually identifies this as a rape going on under his kind of control, that somehow it's going to reflect poorly on his ability to get promoted. So for all those reasons, they do things like non-judicial punishment. I mean, you commit a felony crime, it's non-judicial punishment, or they do things like not pursuing it. They have the ultimate authority to determine whether or not it's going to go to court-martial, whether it's going to be investigated, and they can just choose not to do it. So
this is why it's important to take it out of the chain of command.
Correct.
And if you take it out of the chain of command, then how are these issues resolved?
So you create, in my bill, you create an office within the military made up of experts in prosecution and investigations. You file a complaint with that office. They evaluate it. If they think it should go forward to court-martial, it moves forward. And if not, then it's bumped back to the commander, who can then take steps to offer some other kind of punishment.
But it's handled still within the military,
within
right?
The military.
Are these ever taken outside the military to a criminal court?
Only
if the attack or the event happens, among military personnel inside the military.
No. And if you recall, in the Arlington, Virginia case, the Air Force lieutenant, there was actually an effort to try and take the case internally, and the request was made, and the local DA said no, they weren't going to allow that to happen.
Would not allow that to happen, right. And back to this, it just puzzles me as to why. Your analogy to the Catholic Church, I think, is right on. But there's also some sort of has always been, right, a sort of a macho mentality, right, to the military. For so long, it still is, I guess, male-dominated. For so long, it was almost exclusively male, and women were always considered secondary and maybe there for men to take advantage of in many ways.
So it is, a male-dominated environment, but it's really important to point out that there are men who are assaulted, actually in larger numbers than women in the military,
right?
Because it's about power. It's about asserting power over someone.
Larger
else.
Numbers? Really?
Yes, only because there's more men in the military.
More men, right?
So they actually are about 50 to 60% of those who are assaulted are men.
So it really comes down to power, isn't it?
That's
what it's all about. So in the Congress, do you think we will see some action on this? I mean, I know Congress is really busy, although there's others. We have to have more hearings on Benghazi, right? Now we have to have hearings up the gazoo on the IRS. I'm sure we will, right?
Right. With good reason to. I mean, that's where we should kind of be putting our focus, is on the IRS and not on Benghazi.
Right. It's true, between those two, and also on other things like gun safety and climate control and all those others on unaddressed issues. How about this issue? Do you think we're going to see some action? Where is the...
there are a number of us who are just pushing very hard to make sure there is action. But it's interesting. Some people want to say they want to do something, but they truly want to keep the status quo because, it's really seen as almost unpatriotic to take on the military. So, believe it or not, I mean, it's like, to me, patriotism is about protecting every person that goes into the military, just not a particular group. And I want men and women to be able to enlist in the military and know that it is not a haven for sexual predators.
Yeah, well, that seems to me that should not be a hard sell to make, but it apparently is. 866-55-PRESS, love to get your comments on that. So what is the, what kind of, so you're saying even inside the Congress, it's hard to get the votes, right? And I know you're...
So my bill has 122 co-sponsors right now.
Really? Yeah.
And we will gain many more. The bill was just introduced a few weeks ago, the second bill that I've introduced. Mm-hmm. And there is growing sentiment that these cases need to be taken out of the chain of command. But this is, when you say you want to take these cases out of the chain of command, you are challenging the essence of the military structure.
Right. You're taking them.
Yet, if you look at our system, which is based on the British system, I mean, our Uniform Code of Military Justice, which Congress created back in the 1950s, is based on the British system. Well, if you look at the UK, look at Canada and Australia, they have taken these cases out of the chain of command.
They have.
They
right.
have. And since 1996. And they've had good success with taking those steps. And I talked with Secretary Hagel last night. Says, can we at least have you look at the British system? We've actually studied it. I've sent staff over to London to really evaluate it. And I think that if they really look at what's being done and how successful it's been, they may be more apt to try it maybe on a pilot program basis.
You've been the lead in the Senate, in the House, working closely, I know, with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator Patty Murray, and others in the Senate as well. So when you talk to military officers, do you get any support for this? Privately, maybe? Officially, right, as you just indicated, the official position of the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense is, no, we need to leave it in the chain.
You know where I
get
get a lot of support?
Yeah.
From retired military.
Really? Yeah.
Because they feel like they can speak without fear of, some kind of action taken against them. So I think they get it. I think many of them are starting to understand it. The case in Aviano, Italy, where a lieutenant colonel was court-martialed. The convening authority, which was a 3-star general, called on the court-martial to take place, actually appointed the jurors. Conviction, 5-0 conviction, and then this 3-star general overturns the conviction. Yeah. So the attorney from the Air Force who flew over there, the chief general counsel, to try the case, it was in disbelief.
Yeah, I've read about that case. It's just hard, and again, makes it all the more imperative that something be done, that something like your bill be enacted and made the law of the land. 866-55-PRESS. Again, you're welcome to join the conversation, or your comments welcome on Twitter at BP Show. I'd love to hear from some of you members of the military or veterans, men and women, on this issue. We'll be right back with Congresswoman Jackie Speier from California.
Connect with the Bill Press Show on Twitter. Follow us at BP Show and tweet using the hashtag WatchingBP. This is the Bill Press Show.
All right, it's 13 minutes now before the top of the hour here on the Full Court Press. Congressman, one of your colleagues, by the way, Congressman Mark Pocan, is going to be here in studio with us. And we're visiting now with Congresswoman Jackie Speier from California's 14th Congressional District. A good friend. Happy birthday, Congresswoman,
Thank
by
you.
the way. We know it's the continuous celebration of your birthday here. So we were talking about, I want to ask you about some other issues. We were talking about this macho mentality that's dominating the media. When we think that, people have grown up now and they recognize more the rights of women and the place of women, that we've moved on to society, and then you hear somebody like Pat Robertson yesterday on the 700 Club. He's responding. Love to get your response to this. So he's responding to a viewer who complained about her husband was cheating on her, and she was upset about it. And Pat Robertson basically is saying, it's your own dumb damn fault. Here he is.
So, like it or not, males have a tendency to wander a little bit. And what you want to do is to make a home so wonderful that he doesn't want to wander.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so it's your fault, right?
Where's the Ten Commandments in all of his preaching, huh?
I'm a married man. You're a married man. Try using that logic on your wife at home for all the married gentlemen out there and see what kind of reaction you get.
But this is coming from, Pat Robertson.
Well, I think he's kind of stuck in the Mad Men mentality of the 50s and 60s.
He ran for president at one time, too. On this issue we've been talking about, let's say hello to John, is calling from Worcester, New York. Is that it? Worcester, sorry. Hey, John. How you doing?
Good morning, Bill, and happy birthday, Representative.
Thank you.
Bill, I'm wondering how much of a problem moral waivers are as far as enlisting goes. Also, how much of a problem are contractors in a war zone regarding sexual assault?
Okay, Congresswoman.
So, two good questions.
Thanks, John. Take your answer on the air, if you would. Thanks.
The moral waiver issue, there was a period of time when we were building up the surge in Iraq that moral waivers were being granted.
I don't know what that means.
Well, that's where you might have an offense, a criminal background check will show that you've had some kind of a violation. Sometimes they're moral in nature.
They put that aside because we need you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or that you somehow have...
Are they still in place?
No, these waivers, no, they're not using these waivers at all. And I would think a good part of that universe of people has since left the military. But that is a concern. And then his second question was about contractors. And yes, there's been plenty of incidents of contractor sexual assault and abuse.
But they're not subject to the military code of law or code of justice, are they?
They are not. I don't believe they are, no.
Chuck is calling from Jacksonville, Florida. Hi, Chuck.
Good morning. I have an assumption I'm going to make, and the Congress or the congressman or senator can correct me on this. If Bill Press is the CEO of Apple or ExxonMobil, he's going to make absolutely positive sure that none of this happens in his organization, because if I'm on a jury and something does, the punitive damages are going to be so severe that this isn't going to happen. So I'm assuming that the military doesn't have the people in the military don't have the right to sue.
That's absolutely correct.
And the lawsuits, that's the difference. The people in the private sector are no more different than the people in the military. The people in the private sector, again, if Bill Press is the CEO of a corporation, he's going to make damn sure that nobody in his organization does that. If they do, they're out the door and gone.
All right. Thanks, Chuck. I think that's
absolutely right. It's called the Ferris Doctrine, and it basically provides that when you're in the military, any hazard, any occupational hazard, you can't sue for it. So the fact that you're in the military and you get sexually assaulted, that's considered an occupational hazard.
I do want to ask you about the IRS. Now, the president we have the Inspector General's report. The president has made sure that the acting head of the IRS is out there. He said put some new safeguards in place. Does that resolve the issue in your mind?
No. I think this is an issue that really does require Oversight and Government Reform Committee to do something. To really drill down. And because, the problem at the IRS is there's incredible discretion. And I don't even think we kind of focus on it at all. But they do have a remarkable purview. And it's witnessed here by the kinds of steps that were taken and by civil service personnel. And we're going to also see how the civil service system works in the next months and years, because, of course, that process is long and tedious.
Yeah. No, I think this is a chance, where an opportunity, and I think a requirement. Congress really has to, I think, help define exactly what constitutes a 501c4 and who should be able to get these tax exemptions and who should not.
Well, and the original law said exclusively for social welfare purposes. And then it was the IRS that interpreted it to be primarily for social service purposes and then never defined primarily. And so this is why we're in the situation.
Yeah, and then they leave some people that are 100% political, like Karl Rove, and, he gets the tax exempt status. So, yeah. Let's focus on that and hopefully and on to some of this other stuff. Thank you again for your leadership on this important issue, Congresswoman, and for your time this morning.
My pleasure.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Posen, Michael Gerhardt, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America's